All right, now we're into the second video of our anatomy studies, and this is a study of the arm. Even though you can see above on this canvas, we've already shot the study of a foot. That'll come a little bit later. And actually, the foot painting that you see here above what I'm blocking in now is actually done in a pretty similar method to what we see here. But what you will see here is I'm going to have to be working much quicker, much more efficiently. As you can see, our poor model here is holding a bag so that we can see a little bit of muscles activated. And actually, there's not really anything in the bag. It's just a little bit of a weight and enough weight that already combined with her hand, it's pretty challenging to hold up. So this is going to be actually a little bit quicker of a video just because there's going to tend to be a bit more breaks in the video, which we've edited out here, but it does make for a speedier video, and that means that some of these little bits that I'm going to have to hit, these little pieces of anatomy, are going to have to be a little bit more direct and a little bit more on the spot from the beginning here. So we're blocking it in first with just a basic mixture of some browns, a burnt sienna, ultramarine blue here, to get some of the warmths that we're going to see here in the flesh tones, and the skin here on the model is pretty golden, sort of golden brownish orange. You can't quite see as much with the color now. When we move up to the close-up and get a little closer, you'll see some of the true colors of the model when we switch over to the picture-in-picture. Right now they're just a little blown out because of the light that we have on the model versus the light on the canvas here. So we can see I've started with a toned canvas, just like the last video with the torso, only it's toned a little bit up more of a warmer gray, which is actually kind of close to what we see on the background here with the actual lights on the background. The background wall is kind of a gray. We have a light back there that's making it a little bit more of a warmish gray here. So we started with that tone. That'll get me a little closer at least to seeing the correct values as well as the correct colors, so that I can be quite a bit more direct. And that's really imperative with these studies, these anatomy studies. The point is not to noodle and go back and forth until everything is what we feel to be 100% perfect. It's to get an immediate statement of the anatomy and of the color, and even working in the way we want to be working, so that we can sort of get a quick, fresh practice of all of these where we're fine-tuning our immediate observational skills and also capturing exactly what's necessary as opposed to the superfluous, which will hold us back. And especially in a situation like this where a large piece of this goal is to get some of the gestural qualities of this, as well as in anatomy specifically, and trying to get some of the little bits of anatomy that sort of bulge and poke out and are exaggerated a little bit more during action. Those little details need to be caught rather quickly if we're going to hope that they stay through the painting throughout it. And this would be something very commonly done in more complex compositions of the past, where it wouldn't be possible for a model to hold a pose like this for this period of time. So it would be more of a series of quick studies that are compiled together to make something that appears more finished, as opposed to a model actually holding some of the poses we see in paintings of the past, which just really wouldn't be terribly possible. So we can see I've already got a quick outline of the arm here, and even with some of the overlapping of lines, as we saw with the drawing here, helps to suggest some of the form with the bicep and as well as the forearm leading into the upper arm. Those just little enough of overlaps help to describe the weight and volume of the form of the arm. And now I'm digging into the shadow map, and even though I'm thinking of this as an anatomy study, I'm still starting it on the foundation of a shadow map, just the overall pattern differences of light and dark. And that will allow me to build muscle on top of it more confidently, so that when I place the more sensitive curvatures and bulges of each of these muscles, they're placed on the right spot instead of kind of haphazardly and requiring the need to rework. That is something that I see very often in less experienced artists and students, is that they might dig into the detail a little too fast, and thus they miss that overall structure here. So we're getting into a palette shot here. Again, you can just see the colors that I'm mixing. It's a burnt sienna and an ultramarine blue here, just to get a nice, rich, warm brown. It's essentially pretty much like an umber. The difference really is that I can add a little bit more variety into this mixture. So it's not just a flat color, but there's just the tiniest amount of variation in the actual strokes that I'm laying up there. And then also I can shift the underpainting ever so slightly lighter or darker a little more easily, as well as a little warmer or cooler a little more easily, just by the actual variation of the amount of blue versus the sienna in there. It makes a nice, really rich, deep dark, and really glowy warms and sort of lights and half-lights there. So it's a mixture that I tend to favor, especially in a situation like this where we are seeing a lot of warm bits poking through, sort of shining through our reference here. And it'll allow me to get something that's a little bit closer in color and definitely quite a bit closer in value, kind of right off the bat here. So that's my mixture choice here, and you can see as I dig and kind of scrape into it even a little, it changes sort of the quality of the color, even some warm on the left to a little cooler on the right. I'm paying a lot of attention right now even to edges. Again, something else that I see neglected quite frequently, but it is fairly important. As you can see, the edges for example, the soft on the left versus that really, really crisp edge of the arm underneath here, that gives a sense of form already. And those really crisp edges help paint to look nice and juicy, and pop and stand out right away. Where if everything is too hazy and too fuzzy, then the painting itself tends to look a little bit flatter, and it's not going to stand out as much. And then because of that kind of flatness caused by the hazy quality of the underpainting application, students will often tend to over-exaggerate the values to get that pop, that dynamic quality, and they ultimately push the values too far in one direction or another. And then if it's carried over into the color, then they often push the chroma too far one direction or another. You can see I'm using just a pretty big bristle brush here. And I dipped into just last year to a lot of mineral spirits when I laid that stroke down. And actually I just dipped into a little bit more mineral spirits here, and that's just to stretch that color out and get it into a little bit more of a thinner state. And now I'm even just taking a paper towel and lifting off, and that gives me a really nice toning of the, really close to the value of the arm there right away. Just kind of filling the shapes, and I'm still thinking pretty abstractly at this point. I'm getting acclimated to the anatomy that's up there, but I'm definitely still thinking in terms of just the shapes, the shadow map of light and dark. And even though we have right now, you can see the picture-in-picture is actually literally just a photo. It's not the model at this point. There's still a lot of shifting happening, so there's really no point in digging into the detail yet, as I'm still kind of working through just a basic value structure of what I'm seeing up there. And when the model is especially going to be moving as much as we have in a situation like this that's more dynamic, it really just doesn't make sense to jump into little details before I've established this overall hierarchy of values here. You know, it's very similar to how we'd proceed with the drawing. I'm still painting in terms of big, broad, straight lines. You know, again, just back to our drawing ideas that we explored last term. Getting major angles, major tilts. Those are the most important things right now as I adjust the values here. Because of that, I can use a relatively large, blunt bristle brush here. I'm not needing any fine, small brush or any fine lines to get these larger shape ideas. If I jump to a brush that's too small too soon, it's very likely that we're going to dig into far too much detail before we're ready here. And see, I can just lay down a nice splotch of series of splotch colors there, and then wipe it out with the rag, get a nice base tone. I'm using a pretty absorbent canvas here. It's some linen, but it is pretty highly absorbent. So you can see, you know, we're barely, you know, 10 or 15 minutes into this painting here, and some of those marks underneath that I laid down initially, those basic scheme lines, those are already dry. All right, so we're digging into some color here. I'm not really going with any formula of mixture here. I'm just kind of observing the model, and then I've selected my red and yellow and blue that's in the value range that I want. So that's first. I'm identifying the value range of the color I want to paint, and then I try to select a color family that I want to be working in, and then I start to build up a big base puddle of that, as you can see, and then I added a little bit of the 3 red, yellow, and blue here to modify the chroma of it, the intensity of it, and then I laid a little piece down, and then from that little piece, even though I mixed a very large puddle there, from that little piece I was able to ask myself or tell myself, does it need to be lighter or darker? In this particular case it was lighter. And does it need to be more red, more yellow, or more blue? And you know, was it the correct family? Now the family needed to be a little bit more on the yellow side, so I dug a lot more into the yellows. The chroma was pretty good though, and so as you can see, even though I started with that fairly large puddle on the right, I shifted over to that puddle on the left that was a little more yellow. I left that original puddle so I could see just how far I needed to shift that color. And now I've got a very large puddle that's close to you know, the family and the value and the chroma that I need, and so I can start to just lay in these sort of bigger chunks of paint that exist in that value and family and chroma range, and kind of play around with the color a little bit and push it in one direction and another to try to help describe the form. Keep in mind that I'm working in the light side, meaning you know, my values need to be pretty restricted to the values in the light on the model, and thus a lot of my form has to be created by the shifting of color. You know, being in one piece of our shadow anatomy, in this case center light, and slightly moving over into some of the halftones, that means that my chromas are going to stay pretty consistent for each of those pieces. So, you know, all the chroma in the center light is going to be relatively the same chroma. A lot of the chromas in the halftones are going to be relatively the same chroma. A lot of chromas in the shadows are going to be relatively the same chroma. They might be different chromas from each other. I might have a different chroma in the lights, a different chroma in the halftones, and a different chroma in the shadows, but they'll all be similar chromas to each other. And that will really help the painting feel a little more joined together and not disconnected. And that's something that I see quite frequently, is that students may hit the color family kind of correctly. They may hit the value fairly correctly, but they really jump around way too much in the chroma. They put a really dull piece of paint next to a really overly chromatic piece of paint, and as a result you tend to get this kind of muddy, ripply jump kind of look to it. And so that can be easily resolved by bringing those chromas a little closer together. So I've got my rosemary comber brush here that I'm starting to lay some paint in, and I'm working pretty thickly. There's just a tiny bit of medium that I'm using, which is just some oil here. just to really get some flow of the paint here. But I'm really trying to work more in really solid pieces of paint here. Really establish quite a bit on here so that I can lay back on top of it and soften it out a little bit later, and then build a little bit more anatomy on top. But you can see I'm trying to work in bigger, broader pieces of paint. Really try to see things as large of shapes as possible. And I am kind of following either with or across the form for each of these strokes. So that stroke followed with the form of the bicep here. And then I try to modulate the piece right next to it so I can throw another stroke also following the form of the bicep next to it. I'm just trying to work my way around this arm here and fill in as much of the color as possible, and then just slowly modifying each of these pieces as needed. You know, the nice thing about one of these studies is that I'm not going to be too overly concerned with the paint application here. I'm, you know, as far as the surface quality of the painting, that can be one of my concerns, but you know, there's enough to worry about already, especially with a pose like this. If we're increasing the challenge of the painting by tackling something more difficult for the model to hold, for a study like this, I may sacrifice my ability to look at the or to control as much the exact finish of the painting, and just try to lay it down in the most economical way possible and the most informative way possible. So when I look back at this painting, I have a deeper understanding of what it was I was looking at. So in this case, that means following the form of the anatomy with each stroke, trying to make each stroke as long as the piece of anatomy appears to be, whether it's a tendon or an actual muscle here, or piece of bone that's sticking out, but really trying to say as much as I can with a smaller amount of paint, and only softening when I really need to bring some of these shapes closer together, when maybe I've laid down a piece like I just done and it was a little too over described for that area, so I need to maybe knock it down a little bit. I'll do that at this stage. Especially, you know, again, this canvas is more absorbent. Things are drying and setting up a little faster, which means I don't necessarily need to wait until the end of the session to soften things out, maybe like I did with the last video here. So I'm doing quite a bit more of the actual softening while I go. Just kind of building up this kind of big soupy collage of paint on here. With this more toothy, slightly more absorbent canvas, and trying to really mix a lot of paint on here to work with, you can see the paint is really going on kind of buttery and velvety, which is a very satisfying paint quality. I can't stress enough the importance of using enough paint when painting, especially doing something like this. I've rarely found students at this stage of their study that do use enough paint, and most students are really just thinning and stretching paint out too much, mixing puddles that are just far too small, and you know, that all stacks up to have some negative impacts on the painting. You know, if you don't use enough paint, you know, when you go to lay this on, the paint is stretched too thin, and it shifts the value of the color. It also shifts the quality of the color quite a bit. And if the little puddles of paint are too thin, well then it just makes it harder to mix the color that we need to mix. You know, I see students all the time with, you know, 100 little puddles of paint scattered all throughout their palette, and they just can't really see how one little puddle over on this left side might relate to this tiny little puddle way over on the bottom right side, as opposed to something, you know, where I'm working really trying to get substantially larger puddles like this, that I can just modify bit by bit to get more subtle shifts in color and value. And what will generally happen, and I'm seeking out some anatomy of the shoulder there, what will generally happen is that because I'm typically mixing directly under the color that I'm going to be laying down, my values tend to go from lighter on the left to darker on the right, and that's just pretty typical for my uh, string of colors that I get on my palette, especially when I have my palette set up in this way that I have, where I've got the five values of color, five values of red, yellow, and blue. You can see I've got a really, really light red, yellow, and blue on the left, and then it gets to be the next value set. I have two yellows and a red and a blue, and then the mid value red, yellow, blue, and then it gets darker and darker, which is red, yellow, blue, repeated over and over again. That's really just to help me organize my values so I can go directly under where it is I'm mixing. And what you may notice when you look at my palette is that I don't have any white laid out right now. I do have those really light red, yellow, and blues on the left, but when I add those into the mix, I'm not thinking of uh, that I'm going to be lightening or darkening my color with them. I'm just thinking that's the value I need, so I'm going to pull it straight down and mix right there, as opposed to taking that really light red, yellow, and blue on the left and mixing it into some of those colors on the right, which would really kill my chroma potential of those areas. So this way of mixing and sort of conceptualizing paint really helps us to avoid dead colors because you're using the correct color that's associated to the value that you need. So you need a mid-value color, you use mid-value paint. You need a light color, you use lighter paint. And that's just a more logical way to paint than to always take darker colors and add white to them. I see flesh tones get destroyed quite frequently because of that. The real danger with something like this is that you can end up with really, really colorful paint if you don't neutralize your color enough. There's almost nothing that's super strongly red or yellow or blue in nature, and especially flesh tones tend to be a little bit lower chroma. So you really just need to make sure that you've equalized your red, yellow, and blue enough to get a low enough chroma that you need when working in flesh tones. So I'm laying in some darker darks here, just for that really dark shadow there of the close to the armpit. And then it's going to have to get lighter as it moves throughout the rest of the arm. Trying to maintain that edge quality that I've laid down earlier. So you can see I need to keep it in this red family, this higher chroma red family here, and so as I lighten up this darker puddle, I don't dip all the way to my lights, my light red, yellow, and blue on the left. I'm dipping into my next puddles over of red, yellow, and blue. I'm dipping into my slightly lighter red, yellow, and blue to modify this puddle, and I'm working my way slowly to the left side of the palette as I gently raise the value. That's an appropriate way of mixing to really make sure you get the correct color, the correct value as well as the correct chroma of your paint without just killing it and getting it dead and washed out. Historically there's a lot of artists like Rubens who would say never let white enter your shadows. And this really refers to just the richness that you should be having in the shadows, which happens because you're mixing good, strong, clean color, and then maybe laying it a little more transparently. At least back then when they had less colors to choose from. Now we have so many colors. As you can see, I've got a red, yellow, and blue in just about every value here. I can just mix those red, yellow, and blues of the correct value and lay it in, and not have to use any white at all to get the color and the value that I require. And as you can see, that's keeping my shadows a lot more rich and a lot more clean. Definitely not washed out and hazy. And so if you want those juicy, rich, clean color shadows, this is going to be the way to do it, at least until you're a little more familiar with the dangers associated with mixing white into your color and how to compensate for that. So I'm following some of the forms a little bit in the shadow. So it's building a little bit of volume there, but I'm not putting too much information in the shadow. I'm really switched to a much larger comber for this area here. So I'm making these nice big broad strokes and leaving my smaller strokes for the shadow area here. I'm sorry, for my smaller strokes for the lighter areas here. I'm picking up on a little bit of this kind of bluish green at some of the halftones, right at the terminator where the light turns to dark. So it's probably picking up off of some of the grays on the wall. That's usually where our core shadows are coming from, just sort of the ambient light in the room, which would be more of the grayish color. And then, of course, a sort of a bluish gray on top of a golden skin like this is going to produce some of this sort of greenish cast that's kind of reminiscent of those Italian paintings of old. We always see that greenish core at the transition between lights and darks. And so we're just laying a little bit of that in. Now, again, the key here is not to overshoot that. If you identify that there's a little bit of green there, which most of my students are able to do pretty easily, you have to make sure you don't blow that green out to where it no longer looks natural, like it belongs to human flesh. And that's unfortunately something that's not as easy to do as simply identifying it. Students are typically quick to pick up on that green and then quick to make it so green it doesn't look like it belongs on human flesh. So remember to keep that a nice neutralized low chroma. You know, books of the past recommend just using a ivory black, and when you paint for an ivory black for your underpainting, and then when you paint the golden flesh tones on top of it, you allow that core shadow to be a little more transparent. So the little bit of transparent gold on top of that ivory black underpainting gives you just enough of the greenish blue cast to facilitate that turning of the form, and it's a little bit safer as opposed to using a more intense blue like an ultramarine blue or a cobalt to create that green at the halftones. That can be really, really dangerous. You see I've got a completely different brush for my lights than for my darks. That's pretty paramount. Something that should just be in all of your painting practices, just for sake of organization and simplicity. I'm just kind of working color in, following these forms. And just every time I go to modify a color, remember I'm asking myself, is it the same color family? Is it the same value? Is it the same chroma? So if it needs to go lighter, I move to a red, yellow, and blue left of where I'm mixing. If it needs to go darker, I move to a red, yellow, blue to the right of where I'm mixing. If it needs to go more chroma, I push it more towards one color. If it needs to go lower chroma, I push it towards more equal distributions of red, yellow, and blue. And even though I'm in a situation where here I can really try to match the color that I'm seeing, remember it always comes down to, in the end, just a set of relationships of what you see. So, you know, at some point you have to call something on your painting the correct color or the correct value or correct chroma so that we can use that as an anchor to establish the rest of the painting. And unfortunately, I've seen many situations where a student may have laid down the background color and then some color for the light and some color for the darks and then worked on it for quite some time and then realized it didn't look right, and so they want to wipe the whole thing off, and they may destroy all of their work when really maybe all that was wrong was that one of those three pieces was incorrect. So maybe the shadow side didn't have a high enough chroma or wasn't quite the right color, and as a result it threw off the appearance of the lights and the appearance of the background enough for them to think, oh well, the flesh tones are dead, or this isn't right at all, and they think it needs to be scrapped altogether, when in many cases it's just a modification of one of those three. And it takes some experience to realize that, but you can keep in mind that because everything we're dealing with is a set of relationships, there should never really be a case where we would have to say, well, everything on here is completely irreparably wrong and needs to be completely scraped down. Because if we develop our ability to coax out correct relationships with what we have, then it should be like drawing, where you should be able to say, well, I'm going to call one thing correct even though it's not quite what's up there, and I'm just going to adjust the surrounding area a little more red, more yellow, more blue, or lighter or darker to make everything be correct. And that's important, and it's tough to realize that and to jump into that, but it's kind of imperative, because if you're working from working from life, where your subject is three-dimensional, then there are going to be planes of the model that are facing light, and thus lit up more so than your canvas can be lit up in many situations. And there's going to be times when you don't have quite the best light on your canvas, and it's not going to bring out quite as much color as what you see on the model. So it's always going to come down to some degree to be a set of relationships, as opposed to literally matching what's there, which we might be able to do with a photograph, but it's very difficult, if not impossible sometimes, to do when working from life. And so it's something we just have to bite the bullet and learn to do. You can spend the beginning, kind of like actually what I'm doing here, and trying to mix as close as possible to what's there and lay it all down. And then once all the cards land where they will, we have to just build up the accurate relationships and fine-tune things more and more and get it closer and closer to as correct of relationships as possible. You can see I'm trying to avoid still at this point mixing actual colors into other colors, and trying as much as I can to actually lay down additional pieces in between each of these strokes to facilitate the transition from one color into another. This is kind of like a fact gathering stage, where I'm just trying to put down, isolate, identify, and put down as much color in the correct direction as I can before I move on to some of the more finishing stages of trying to really carefully sculpt out the form a little bit more and the finish of the painting a little bit more. And now I've got quite a bit down now for my background. I'm sorry, for my arm, and I'm going to come in and see if I can carve some of this out, which is going to give me more precise control over the shape of the arm, as well as some of the edges. If I'm dipping a firm little bristle brush into some thinner, and I use that to just carve out a little piece of background. And normally, if I'm working on a really non-absorbent surface, I can use that to carve out the entire background of my subject and really get super precise and figure out some of the edges I want, and really get broken edges for sure. It really makes some of the paintings look higher resolution by being able to go in and do that, because removing paint tends to create harder edges, especially when we're using a stiff bristle and some thinner here. But this canvas is a little more absorbent than I'm used to, and as a result, I'm not going to be able to go in and just strip away surrounding paint. I couldn't quite get into that anti-cubital area as much as I wanted, so I'm going in now with some actual paint And I'm going to start to lay in some background, and hopefully as I do that, maybe carve out the form just a little bit more. And you can see I'm trying to keep these edges really nice and crisp, so that the anatomy of this arm really stands out. And I can always go back and soften the edges as I need to, but for now it's going to read juicier, brighter, richer, more colorful if I keep my edges a little bit harder. So I'm trying to kind of seek out the color right now to be correct, and then once the color is correct, I can start to dig in now here with that arm and really carve the shape of the arm a little bit more precisely. Still using a big brush, that's something that students tend to forget, is that you can use a really big brush to carve out a sensitive area, and as a result it'll help the background feel more integrated into the arm and into itself, rather than if we use just this tiny little brush to try and go around the form. And when I see students use that smaller brush to dig into it and go around the form, it tends to make this kind of lighter halo around the subject. So instead of it looking like one shape painted into another shape, it looks like they tried to paint an arm in this case, and then put just this hazy white light around it. So it doesn't read as correctly as something like this, where we've got the arm standing out against a broader shape, like is actually happening with the model here. So don't be afraid to use that big brush. Work in one spot, modifying the color until you're pretty darn confident that it's correct, so that you can go in and using a big brush, and on the edge of that brush go in and just carve out those areas there. See, I can even suggest some of that texture of the wall if I want to with this comber here. Just some firm pressure applied. It gives me nice hard edges, and can give me some softer edges. Really make this look like paint, and then just really scrub some of that paint on there. Notice I'm using a different method for painting this background. I didn't just isolate the value that I need and drop right down underneath it. I could have done that, but it was a pretty light value for this background wall, and it was also really, really low chroma. And I actually felt the most appropriate blue to use in this case was an ivory black, because ivory black is such a low chroma, and it's a much more convenient and ideal color to use for such a low chroma gray like this background, instead of having to use one of my higher chroma, more expensive colors, and then just all load those together to neutralize out, which is more expensive and a little more challenging, because you add just a little bit more of one color and it could shift your family or your chroma too much. Whereas the ivory black there already starts out at such a nice low chroma that I could add just a little bit of color to it and keep it kind of that low chroma blue, but just shift it a little bit greener, a little bit more purple as needed. Now I'm just digging back in. I'm helping the arm meet the background. This idea of painting shapes into other shapes. It's kind of an important idea. Allows you to avoid that whole sort of light, frothy halo that happens when students kind of do their drawing first, and then they're afraid to disrupt their drawing so they don't quite paint all the way up to it. So I've got some those soft on, soft off brush strokes from term 1 that we did on those charts. And you can really see how that helps some of these muscles and these softer edges fade one into another without losing too much of the chroma there. It's really going to require a more sensitive understanding and knowledge of the brush and the canvas you're working on. You can see I am holding the brush a lot further back for most of these strokes, and that allows me to have that really gentle integration of one color into another. Now, this is the part of a painting that I think students tend to have a bit more trouble with, especially if you're unexperienced with color. And this is going back into an area after it's already been painted a bit, and then trying to identify, first of all, exactly what the correct value, family, and chroma is, and then mix up some more paint to paint back into it, and just slightly modify to coax out a few more transitions in color. Um, I would say that that's definitely a little bit more of an advanced technique, especially working wet into wet. Students tend to miss either the value, the family, or the chroma, and then they can start to ruin some of the area that they were working in. And by doing that, that makes them a little more nervous about going back into those areas, which makes them usually use thinner paint also, which makes more of a problem ultimately. So I would say that at this stage, it's probably ready to move forward, and then maybe soften some things out and go in for some finishing touches, um, until you get a little more experience with and comfort with mixing the color, so that you can go back in and really lay right on top of some of these areas and match some of the color and the family, the chroma and the value right away. I mean, it shouldn't be that hard to mix. I mean, if you lay down like I just did there and saw, oh wow, that's too dark, you should still be able to come back in and right away start to modify the value, right away start to modify the family and the chroma, and then paint right on top of it, just like that. And that should work out. And if you are critically assessing each brushstroke that you lay down, that is how it will work out. And everything will turn out fine, and all the colors will mix appropriately into each other. What I tend to see is that students lay down something that they don't really stop to think about if it's correct, and so they just keep making the brush mark, trying to kind of blend that incorrect color into the rest of the color around it, kind of this licking of the canvas. And that tends to destroy all of the color built up in that area, as well as all the edge work and the value. So, excuse me, you're really going to need to lay right into a piece of color and then stop for just a second and assess if you think it's correct or not correct, and how to modify it to make it correct. And don't be afraid to spend more time mixing on the palette and less time actually laying paint down on your canvas. There's nothing wrong with that. I am starting to modify a little bit of the edge work in here, but really trying to modify it with the addition of color. Um, and that's, again, it's a little more advanced way of modulating edges, but it is the goal that we ultimately want to shoot for. The more variety of accurate color we can get in here, the more voluminous the form will appear. And keep in mind that that's a different idea than just getting a lot of color in here. And some artists will tell you, to just get as much color as you can in there. But there is some caution there, because if it's not close to the right family, close to the right chroma, then that really destroys the credibility and the realism of a picture. A painting itself can be highly realistic without a lot of color. It just makes it a little more difficult to describe as many of the form transitions and variations if we're just dealing with value than with color. And that's where the danger of overmodeling comes in. And that's something that gets touched on a lot here. But if you're able to get all these subtle variations in color, then that's how you want to load your painting with color. It's just with those little subtle, tiny shifts and variations that when you step back from the canvas, 5, 10, 15 feet away, those all merge together into a sort of an overall color. And if you can lock in onto this idea of the sort of ambiguous colors that you can't really put your finger on when you're looking at the model, those can be created, kind of like the bottom of this arm here, the forearm in the shadow. There's some interesting kind of purplish, greenish, goldish color that's kind of hard to put your finger on. That happens when you get all of these colors of a really close chroma in here and a close value, and you kind of dance them with a little bit of variety. Really observe and get close to the model as you need to see this tiny little variation. And then when you lay that all in and you kind of step back, it has this just wonderful vibration of all of this color and all this volume, and it's hard to exactly pinpoint exactly what color it is you're looking at, because you are looking at so many colors. And that is an admirable goal to reach, but you never want to overstate those colors too much and make it look unnatural. And if it ever, the way to determine if it looks unnatural is to step back, 5, 10, 15 feet. And if you step back that far and it looks kind of awkward or non-realistic, unlike the model that's up there, then it's an indication that you probably pushed some of those colors too far and you need to bring those back. And if need be, opt for less chroma rather than more chroma to make it look a little more natural, a little more realistic. You'll see there's a lot of situations where I just lay one little stroke down there and realize that it's not quite right, and I dig back into the palette. And that is completely fine, and that's better than loading up your painting with a lot of bad information. Try to keep as little incorrect information on that palette as you possibly can. And I actually have so much paint on my canvas right now, which is actually, this is typically a lot more paint than I generally have on my canvas for a painting of this size and this type. I've got so much paint that the colors that I'm laying down now on top of this foundation of the arm that I have are not ending up being the exact colors of what I'm mixing, unless I go really, really thick and load the brush. As I do a lot of these smaller marks, for example, right now, I'm getting colors that are so very super dark. And when I lay them in, I'm still seeing a lot of color on my canvas, and I'm still seeing some of the initial color in there as well. And that's because there's so much paint now on the canvas that there's a little bit of mixing going on. From the color that I'm mixing on the palette to when I lay it on the canvas, they combine a little bit. And so it's actually this nice quality rather than a stressful quality, because the color is instantly a little bit more integrated. So if you lay something down, it's not so drastically different that it stands out as incorrect immediately. It might actually just fold into the color a little bit more. And that can help make things look just a little more natural and a little more fluid overall, which is nice. It does mean that if you want a more dramatic change from what you already have on the canvas, that you are going to have to either scrape off an area on the canvas, or you're going to have to really do some heavy mixing and paint loading to really create a big change on the canvas, which I know a lot of people are sometimes a little nervous about, laying in that much color to make a big change. But it's nice because with this much color on here, you actually have the opportunity to get a lot more subtlety. As long as you're at least locking into the correct general value and color and chroma. You can't really see too much what I'm doing now because of where the camera set. I'm just laying in a little bit of color for the hand there. Just to give that arm a little bit more context, especially get some of these tendons and muscles that we're seeing cross over the wrist here. This is one of the few videos that we actually have, a separate shot for the palette as well as the painting. So keep that in mind. That doesn't happen very often. It's a little more time-consuming to do that, and there were already so many of these videos to film that eventually you end up starting to see a lot of the same stuff. Most of the videos that I shot were shot with this same palette. Um, so the method of mixing from a full palette, like we see here, is pretty much the same. I'm just pulling directly under the value that I need. I'm mixing a red, yellow, and blue until it's correct, and then I'm laying it down on there. So it's not really a huge point in showing the palette each time. It's not as though for any of these videos I'm really painting something where I say, okay, now for flesh tone, these are the colors that I use, and I mix this amount, and it makes this great flesh color, and so that's what I start with. That doesn't happen in any of these videos. That's more of kind of a formulaic thing that you might discover after many, many years of painting the same types of models under the same lighting conditions. And that really becomes a sort of a signature method of working for an artist. And that's not really what these videos instruct on, and that's something that I rarely, if ever, even do in my own painting. It's usually much more based off of observation, and that's how I work. And so, that's how you can kind of envision each of the colors for all these videos being mixed. It's mixed, anything that's not specifically designated a limited palette. It's mixed with this large range. I have 5 groups of red, yellow, and blue, and I dip into the red, yellow, and blue of the correct value that I need and just go right down below it here and then mix them until they're the correct color family and the correct chroma, and then I just lay it right on the canvas. And then as I mix throughout the videos, I just get this huge band going from light on the left to dark on the right that represents the colors of what I'm painting. And as you can see, there's a lot of color variation within all of that palette, but the chromas are kind of consistent, and there's really no formula or magic to it other than just trying to really closely and carefully observe the color that I see. That's something that you'll get better and better and better at the more you work. And you are going to have to slow down at some point, and maybe for some of those longer paintings that we're going to see later on with the long still life and the long portrait and the long figure painting, you might need to slow down and try to get a color isolator and get really close to your subject and really try to isolate and lock into on little specific individual colors. Because going slow and isolating is the only way to help train your eye to see the colors that are actually there. Otherwise, you're just going to kind of glaze right over what you're actually observing and allow your brain to kind of tell you what it thinks the colors are, and you're going to miss some of these subtle colors altogether. Again, like I've said before, and I'll say I'm sure in a lot of these videos, it's kind of misleading how quickly I'm painting this because I have so much experience, and it was not at all like that when I first started. And in fact, a couple years after I started painting and I began teaching, it was kind of painful for students to watch some of my demonstrations because I worked so slow and I observed so carefully and tried to see as best as I can the little bits of color and little bits of value. And it's a very painful process to watch, very slow process. Not a lot gets done and not a lot happens. But that's actually the way that you need to paint, especially as a student in the beginning when you're trying to learn. You have to learn to observe. Making a painting quick is useless if you haven't observed it correctly and mixed the color correctly. So that's going to require that you go slow and isolate. When I started, I was using a roll of paper towels. I'd stick it up here in the model, and so I could see what the color and value was compared to white. And then that helped me sort of shift my colors one direction or another. I actually recommend students carry a set of isolator cards, a light card with a hole punched in it, a black card with a hole punched in it, and a gray card with a hole punched in it. So that way they can, first of all, figure out the value of what it is they're looking at, and then isolate the color through those cards. And it's going to require at least 2 or 3 value cards to isolate from, because if you try to look at a darker value, like the dark of this arm, through a white card isolator, it's just going to appear black. And then the same is true if you look at a light value through a black card, it's just going to appear white, and so it's not going to give you any color information. So you're going to need a few isolator cards, and you're just needing to go slow, look through the card, mix the color, and then lay it down, and then assess the overall by stepping back. And that's just the process you have to follow. Look through the isolator, assess the color, mix the color, lay it down, step back, and assess your painting. Lots of squinting, lots of letting your eyes go out of focus. I usually close one eye and let the other eye go out of focus a little bit, or maybe squint down a little bit, just so I can see kind of the blurry floating shapes of color and value, and that gives me a good good assessment of the color and value situation that I'm looking at. But yeah, as a result, we don't really have many other videos where you're seeing my palette like this, but that is how everything ends up getting mixed. Just a very straightforward method. I still recommend you doing all the color charts. That's pretty critical, especially if you want to become an alla prima painter, or you want to work with any more limited palettes. That's going to give you a much better understanding of the range that your colors can accomplish. This method of painting just kind of frees up a little bit of your sort of processing power. It allows you to maybe think a little bit more about drawing and value, and really observing correct color and chroma, instead of trying to recall mixing formulas that the color charts kind of help build into you. But I do recall the first time I used the color charts, after I first did them when I began painting, I was able to do a painting in about 2 or 2.5 hours that would have normally taken me about 5 hours to do, because I had the color charts to figure out the colors to mix immediately, instead of having to actually sort of try to figure them out on my palette. So we're moving into a smaller brush now here. Again, this is one of those ideas where you do need to be sensitive enough to your color to be able to lock into an area of the color that you want to mix, and then be able to modify things just ever so slightly to shift it as needed. And again, that's just finer, more fine-tuned, delicate color observation. But like I mentioned before, there's so much paint on here that I do have a little bit of flexibility. It's not just completely, the colors that I'm mixing are not completely overriding the colors that are down there. They are mixing in there just a little bit, which is kind of nice. So in case you didn't catch all the colors that are in the palette from any of the previous videos, we can list them going from left to right here. The first group of colors on the very left, which are those kind of off-white colors, those are actually colors with white mixed into them already. You can buy them somewhat pre-made from Gamblin. They make what are called radiant colors. They're just very, very light colors with some white mixed in them. Or you can mix them yourself, which is what I've done here. And so on the very left here, I usually select a cadmium yellow here, or a cadmium lemon sometimes, for the light yellow, and it's just white with the tiniest little bit of cadmium yellow in there to give it a little more of a yellow tint compared to white. And then right next to that we have a cadmium red light that I've mixed into a large puddle of white. And then next to that we have um, an ultramarine blue with mixed into a large pile of white. And typically how I mix those colors is actually much more ahead of time. I'll put an entire tube of white out and then mix in tiny bits of either the cadmium yellow, the cadmium red light, or the ultramarine blue, and mix them all up with a palette knife on a very clean palette to get them the color and value that I want, which is probably a step above pure white. I'm sorry, a step below in value of pure white. And I'll mix those all up with a palette knife, and then once they're nice and thoroughly mixed, I actually put them inside of a new paint tube and just crimp the back of it. So I actually have large tubes of these colors already pre-mixed and pre-packaged here, so when I go to paint something like this I can just lay them out and I don't have to spend time mixing them, because it does take a few minutes to mix them. I would recommend though, like I said, starting with a lot of white and then adding a little bit of color in there, as opposed to starting with the color and then piling on the white. You may find that you end up using a lot more white than you had anticipated, which is a good lesson for you, when thinking about how to mix light colors, how much white actually does go into some of those lighter values. Next to it, we have the two yellows, and the yellows are cadmium lemon yellow on the left, which I perceive to have a little bit more leaning towards the blue and green. And then we have a cadmium yellow medium right next to that, and that leans a little more towards the warmer yellow. Right next to those we have a cadmium red light, and you can substitute that with cadmium orange, and that's just a very light red, the lightest red you can mix. Oh, I'm sorry, that you can get out of the tube, that doesn't have white added to it. I think that particular one is from Winsor Newton. I found that to be the lightest of the Cad Red lights. Next to that, I have a King's Blue, which you can buy yourself, or I mix it, and I mix it with ultramarine blue and alizarin with some white, and I just get a slight little bit purplish, but mostly blue, and then some white to lighten the value. And the one I have up there is actually a little bit too light, unfortunately, so it's messing a little bit up with my selection of values there. It should be a little bit darker to lock into the Cad medium, or Cad yellow medium there. In the mid-value range, I've got a yellow ochre and a cadmium red medium and a cerulean blue hue, which is actually a phthalo with some white in it to lighten it up. And that actually is a little bit lighter and a little bit more intense in chroma than an actual true cerulean, which dulls out a little more quickly and is a little darker. And keep in mind with each of these colors, especially in the lighter range here, they are a little more varied in value, but they average out to be the value of the section that they're in. And you can see that by the little gray spot that's above each of those colors. We'll take a break from listing the colors here. I'm starting to go in and soften out the edges of all of the little bits of paint that I've laid down in here. So I've got a really soft brush. This is again, this is a comber, but it's a comber that's completely dry. It doesn't have any wet paint, doesn't have any medium on it, and every few brush strokes I'm actually pulling it away and really trying to clean it off on a paper towel, really wipe off as much of that paint as possible, and then moving back in to soften some of this out. So the cleaner I can wipe my brush off, the cleaner each of these colors are going to be. And I'm just really trying to massage in between each area here of paint to really just knock down the transition, soften the edge between one color or value and another. And I've actually got two brushes here. It's kind of hard to see, but I do have a brush for my dark areas that I'm softening colors with, and a brush for my light area that I'm softening colors with. And I switch between them depending on which area I'm softening out here. And so I'm just, again, trying to keep my brush really, really clean, just working in one little area at a time. Even though I'm using a large brush, I want that large brush to get sort of the um, broader shapes nice and soft and not get too noodly right away. I want to get this really kind of hazy and buttery melted together before I come back in with some of my top finishing strokes here. So just gently from one section, one shape to another, softening. I'm going with the form for a lot of it, and then if that's just not softening it enough, I will change directions and go from one shape into another, kind of across the form there. So back to the colors, we had that mid value, which is the yellow ochre, the cadmium red medium, and the cerulean blue hue. Next to that, we move into the next darker range, which for our yellow, I'll have transparent oxide yellow as my yellow there, which is a deeper, darker yellow. And then transparent oxide red or burnt sienna. You can use whichever. I usually tend to favor the transparent oxide red or burnt siennas that are pigment PR101 and transparent enough to be similar to transparent oxide red. And then the blue for that we have is cobalt. And then for the darkest range, our yellow that I have here on the palette is going to be a burnt umber, which gives us some deep dark golds. And then I've got my alizarin and my ultramarine blue. And then sometimes at the end there I'll throw in an ivory black as well, which is just a nice low chroma version of a dark blue that I'll use occasionally as well, for example, like in the background in this painting. And occasionally I'll throw on a viridian as well, which is sort of more of a convenience color for me, just because it helps to neutralize a lot of the colors, especially in flesh tone, very quickly. So I'll use that quite frequently. And then there's some other greens I'll use sometimes as well, some that are actually less powerful than viridian, which are nice to just knock down some flesh tones without getting too crazy and in tinting the color. And I might talk about those as they pop up as well in some of the videos. I do have one red that's kind of around the burnt sienna that I've dipped into for a little bit of this painting, and that's actually sort of a reddish color. That's a Terra Rosa that I've used in here, and I'll use that actually. Sometimes I'll just throw it on the palette there, but it makes a great mixture into some flesh tones, and I really enjoy it for limited palette flesh tone paintings for portraits and figure, where I'll just use a yellow ochre, a Terra Rosa, and an ivory black. That keeps things really nice low chroma, but I can still get some nice rich flesh tone colors, especially in the red and gold range there with those colors. So I'm just going little piece at a time, softening all of this out here, just little bits. And just working one section at a time. I really don't want to jump into too many different values for each softening, because I might pick up a piece of dark value paint and then distribute it into a light area, and then you really start to run into some issues where you may be tempted to just try and soften that out, and then you really mix all your values and mix all your colors, and you just really neutralize things too much and they just get way too dead. So I want to try and be really careful as much as I can here and try to just soften this very gently out. Really clean my brush off as much as possible. Keep that guy as dry as I can. You'll notice I'm also trying to hold my brush quite a bit towards the back of the handle instead of choking the brush at the tip, You know, sometimes it's useful to choke that brush when you need to get into some little detail stuff, but for something like this, where I'm trying to be very delicate and soft, um, with either softening or even with laying paint on, you know, you'll find that holding that brush at the back gives you a much more delicate, sensitive touch there, um, which really facilitates all that softening quite a bit easier. The key to a section like this is really just to have enough patience here to not rush things and overblend things too much. You really need to make sure that everything stays gently mixed. You preserve all of your colors, all of your values, and nothing gets overblended. As soon as that happens, you're going to start to lose your values, your colors, your transitions, and then you're basically going to have to just restate everything here, which is, you know, really a step backwards. Ideally, you know, if we've laid in everything, you know, really, really well in the first half of this, then there should be little more than just softening that we really have to do to make things look correct. And then beyond that, it's just, you know, if we have time, we can make things a little more dimensional. You know, the last video we saw, it was pretty much just softening and then we were done. So that gives us a certain amount of dimensionality. This one, you know, I am going to try and soften all this out and then go back in and try and push some of the form even a little bit more and see if I can add a little bit more variety, a little bit more information, which, you know, if this were a study for a larger piece, that would be the most ideal situation to try and add as much information in here that I can select from for my final piece as I can, as opposed to just trying to get enough there to read correctly. And just remember that these studies are a way for us to acclimate ourselves really to flesh tones that we see in the model under certain lighting conditions. They're a way for us to um, you know, try to pick up on how color shifts are creating volume of form and how much to emphasize some forms and how to play some down. There's a lot to study out of all of this, and everybody has, you know, unique little pieces of anatomy. And you know, these studies, which are, you know, should be relatively quick, you know, ranging from an hour to maybe a few hours. Um, you know, these should really be as much as we can kind of direct statements into the anatomy of our sitter um, as we can manage to accomplish without getting lost into just the endless correction and overcorrection. Um, and the idea is hopefully, you know, you do a lot of these as opposed to spending a ton of time on one of them. And each time you do this, you'll get better at it. You'll get a little more attuned to the anatomy you're looking at, and what needs to be described and what can be left. That is the benefit of doing a lot of studies or alla primas, a lot of you know, observation and restarting and doing it over and over and over again, that you can't necessarily get with longer paintings. And so we want to try and build this into a more normal working repertoire so that we can really be efficient and effective at it and really understand what exactly needs to be described to explain the anatomy that we're looking at. You can see, especially in the shoulder area here and the pectoralis, which is not the main goal of this study, I'm doing a lot more sort of generalized softening, and you can see how immediately flat the area becomes with a lot more of the colors and values pushed together. We lose quite a bit of that dimensionality that's established with the variation of color. And that's okay because, again, the main focus here is the arm, not necessarily the pectoralis. And so it's okay to play that down so that our arm can have a little bit more dimensionality. Just make sure that your brush stays very, very clean, especially as you move from a light area into some of these darker areas. Ideally, again, you want to use a different brush for each value section that you work in. Um, so if you have more distinct value groups in your painting, then you should definitely be using more brushes. You know, two I would say is kind of the minimum number of brushes you'd want to use to keep all of your colors nice and clean while softening. But there's certainly nothing wrong with using 3 or 4 or 5 or even 7, depending on how many little value changes you have developed in your painting. So now I'm really knocking down some of the directional marks in the shadows, especially in the halftones here. And that will, again, just like with drawing, you know, cleaning up that noise, cleaning up those directional marks in the shadows, that's going to help to really push back focus into the light areas and really help us to see volume in the lights. But at the same time, you know, some of, you know, at least on the very, very small micro level, some of these strokes still remain, just like with the strokes of our pencil. And those little tiny variations and subtleties are picked up by the viewer to give a little bit more depth and volume in the shadows that wouldn't be there if we hadn't gone with the direction of form and across the direction of the form in the very beginning. So, you know, they do add up, these little bits to give us all of this volume of form. All right, so we're looks like we're done softening here, and now we're trying to go into some of these top strokes. We're trying to make a little bit more finishing strokes and really bring in our accents of lights and accents of darks in here with the last about 1/3 or so of the painting. And you know, we'll treat this again almost kind of like drawing here, where everything we've done so far has been kind of like our initial notan and stump, and we smoothed everything out, and we've got things to be pretty close to the right edge quality and value. And now we're coming back in with you know, the equivalent of sharp pencils, which is some of these smaller, tinier brushes, locking into the finer tune colors and values here, and laying these tiny little strokes that are going on top, you know, following the form with and across the form here. And hopefully, you know, if either via the pressure that you're holding the brush or the angle of the brush as it approaches the canvas, or even the value and color of the little piece of paint you're laying down, those three factors should help you to modulate the edge quality of the little bits of paint that you're putting on without actually having to go back in with an additional brush and soften it out. And so keep that in mind. Each of these strokes should be pretty mindful to try and help fuse your next piece of paint into all the little tiny pieces of paint that you've already placed on the canvas here. And you know, it'll be up to us how detailed, how much texture, how much little bits of variation we're going to want to leave in this final painting, and how much of it we're going to just smooth out and, you know, get it glassy. You know, especially in a study. I think the guiding factor for something like this, for an anatomy study, should be something more along the lines of, you know, if the little pieces of paint you're putting down look too much like little pieces of paint, you know, too abstract in quality and not descriptive enough of the anatomy or the subject, then it's better to soften it out and just see, you know, a smoother surface quality. You know, we're not really trying to have so much stylization here that it distracts us, the artist, from understanding things more, having more knowledge. You know, your final painting, you can do that all you want. You know, you can have more visible brushwork, you can have more abstraction, you can do whatever you want to guide the aesthetic of the work. But for something like a study like this, it really should be more along the lines of, you know, like our classical canon, where something is clear and ideal before it's beautiful, and you know, really give us knowledge to work off of, and then we can take all these studies and combine them to make whatever type of painting we want. We could take a really nicely done, sort of smoother painted anatomy study like this arm, and then use that as a reference to do a highly impressionistic painting if we wanted. There's no reason we wouldn't be able to do that, but it would be a little bit more difficult to do the reverse. Take something that's highly impressionistic with so much visible brushwork that we can't really see the turning of forms and the subtlety of little bits of anatomy, and try to make an anatomical or clear painting out of that. It's not going to be nearly as easy to do unless you have a ton of anatomy knowledge and understanding of light and color to be able to infuse into that more abstract quality of painting to make it realistic. So it's always better in one of these studies like this, that we're trying to do over and over to get as clear and ideal as we can, so we just have more information to go off of later on. And that'll be even true with a portrait as well. If you're doing a lot of portrait studies for a finished painting, where you might be combining multiple figures, or just using the portrait study as a reference in general, you definitely want to clear up any of the ambiguity and the splashy brushwork and really just make a straightforward, honest study of what you're looking at, as clear and free of abstraction as possible. And then in the final painting, you can just use that as a reference and just paint it however you want. And you're definitely going to gain something more out of that than just by using photo reference on its own, because each stroke we do here, each little piece where we get closer to the final solution, we're having a more intimate understanding and knowledge of the subject and of the overall painting that we're hopefully going to be painting. And each little bit of experience is going to help and infuse into your final painting to make it more strong than it would be otherwise. Whereas a photo, when we're just experiencing it for the first time, you're kind of just responding. Even right now, to a certain level, we're just kind of responding to what we see. But as we respond and as we mix, we build in that muscle memory and that sort of color experience into our subject. So the final will have a little bit more sensitive understanding and knowledge because of that. And you just don't get that from working solely from photos. So even though I'm going in with some finer, more finished, hopefully, details on top of this, notice that I'm still switching to a larger brush as I work away from the main center. That'll help to keep things simple where they need to be simple, so I don't get hung up too much on details that aren't really as important, especially in a study like this. I find this happens quite a bit actually with students, where they'll work on the main area for a while, in this case the arm, and then they might not know what to do from there, or they might be bored with that area, and then they'll switch over to another area, an adjacent area like this pectoralis here, and start working into it, and then just get kind of lost into it, because they don't want to go back and focus again on the arm. And so at least by sticking to some larger brushes for the surrounding area, it's going to limit how long you're able to even work in that area before you need to push back and go back to your center of interest. And of course, if you're still kind of find yourself avoiding your center of interest after a while, that is a good indication that it is time to take a break and then hopefully come back with some more re-infused vigor into that area. Closer and closer to these values as it gets lighter and lighter. We do have that light source pretty darn close to the model's hand here, so those values on the hand do get kind of blown out. That's okay. It gives us a nice lighting quality on the actual forearm, kind of a glancing light instead of a direct light, which is nice. Allows us to see a little bit more of that color variation there. Now that I have the main color and value sorted out for the wrist, and I'm trying to go back in and hit some of the more finer details of the various little tendons in the wrist. This is something that you can't really see as I'm working from the model here, but I really do have to try and hit some of these tendons as effectively and fast as I can, because what's actually happening up there with the model is a lot of shifting going on. She's struggling to carry that bag, and even struggling just to keep her arm up after all of this time. It's a very, very long pose. Um, and so, as the weight gets shifted, as even the arm gets held up, a lot of the muscles are getting activated. And so there's almost like a dancing array of little tendons happening in happening in the wrist over there. And then every time it's just a little too much for her, that's when you see me bounce over to that pectoralis and that shoulder. She lowers her arm a little bit. She gets to rest it just a little bit, and then I can paint some more of the muscles on the shoulder and the pectoralis. And then when she's able to get that arm back up there, then I switch back over to those tendons there, and then try to lay some of those in as quickly and effectively as I can to describe the colors and the shapes that are up there. Just keep in mind that as you do paint some of those tendons and some of those little muscles in there, you don't want it to have the same hard line edge quality all the way through the tendon, because then it's just going to look like a line painted on the model. Keep in mind it is that tendon is sort of like a cable pushing up on the inside of the flesh tone, and so sort of poking out. So it does have that flesh tone, or that skin sort of rounding out the ridge quality of that tendon. So um, it's not going to be a completely hard edge line, so you're going to want to make sure you modify the edge quality. It's going to be a little bit different all the way around, depending on how the actual lighting condition is falling on that little tendon there. You can see almost every time I have to go paint back into an area, I almost always make an error in selecting the color or the value, and then I need to readjust, and then sometimes I make an error in the wrong direction, and then I need to readjust. And that's totally fine. Making that error is a way for us to lock into the correct solution of color and value. And the real trick there, and that's what I said earlier in the video, is to just make sure that when you lay it down and identify that it is incorrect, you just stop, take a step back, take a deep breath, and make sure you are able to adjust that little color mixture to make it a little more correct before you start mixing back into it. And you definitely don't want to just spread that incorrect color all out and ruin the area that you're trying to paint there. I'm kind of fortunate here. We do have a little bit longer, a full 3 hours with this model, even though we are taking, frequent breaks and things are moving a bit. But because of this, I'm getting quite a bit higher level of finish than we might even anticipate for an anatomy study. If you can get a fraction of this for a study, then you're in good shape. What we're going to see next in the next video with the hand is actually quite a bit faster. I think we're looking at maybe an hour or so for the whole thing, and and the hand we have is holding something, and the position shifts quite a bit, and so things have to be quite a bit more direct and end up being quite a bit looser, and it really does have the look of a true study where I'm just kind of getting the gestural quality of the hand more than anything else, with little bits of anatomy in there, which is also something to strive for, whether or not it's full-fledged rendered anatomy, kind of like we're doing here, or just the gestural nature and interaction of some of the shapes. There's lots of ways to do anatomy studies, and I think that like I mentioned before, clarity is the most ideal kind of thing to shoot for in something like this. But it should also be guided by the type of painting that you want to do. If you want to be a really loose, sergeant kind of painter who's dealing with a lot of abstract shapes, then you don't necessarily need to do some of these really, really formal, tight, rendered out anatomy paintings. You should really be focusing on how to marriage the simplification of shapes into anatomy, which is actually something that we see a little bit more in the hand painting next. It's very similar to what's happened here, but the sort of resolution of the painting changes a little bit. Instead of it being softened out and finer detail and little bits of anatomy added on top of it, it's more of a kind of squint down, really see those abstract shapes, and try to marriage that with the anatomy that we see. And again, that kind of idea is dictated by the um, by the type of painter you would like to become. You probably also keep in mind that the canvas here is being lit from above. So a lot of these horizontal strokes that I'm making here, following um, the muscles here and the tendons of the forearm, are actually catching a little bit more light and are probably appearing as a little bit lighter in the video than they actually are, just because they're grabbing a little bit more light from the light source on the canvas. So keep in mind, it would look a little bit different in person. And if you end up painting and realizing that you're just catching so much glare that it's artificially lightening the values that you're painting, you can always just take a really soft brush, like a rosemary badger blend, one of the master's choices, or even sometimes a really soft, fluffy comber here. And after the paint's set up just a little bit, you just kind of do a flick and drag it in a vertical direction. That knocks down a lot of the glare off of the stroke while keeping the qualities of the stroke similar, if not the same. So as I'm bringing these values up in the forearm near the wrist, keep in mind I am keeping a lot of color in there. I'm trying to vary the color quite a bit, and that's how the volume is being maintained, as well as the appearance of more information in there. It's not just taking that flesh color and adding white to it. It's actually making a very thoughtful decision about what the color needs to be as I'm lightening it up. And that is one of the nice things about arranging the palette in the way that it's arranged here, is that anytime you reach for a lighter color, it's always going to be a lighter red or yellow or blue, and that's at least going to hopefully cause you to pause and ask yourself, well, which does it need to be? Does it need to be a lighter red, or a lighter yellow, or lighter blue, or does it need to be a combination of those so that it maintains the same color at a lighter value? If you think you have the perfect color and you need to lighten it up, it's never just a simple solution of adding white or adding one of your light colors. It's going to be adding a combination of them. White tends to have an effect of sometimes neutralizing colors, sometimes shifting colors a little blue. So if you have a nice golden color and you think, well, I want this exact color but lighter, it's not just adding white or even adding white with a red or something like that. You have to specifically say to yourself, if I want this golden color and I want it lighter, then I'm going to have to add white plus enough yellows or reds to and a high enough chroma to combat the neutralization that's happening with the white. So you've got to make sure you add enough color as you add white to maintain the chroma of the color that you like and think is correct, so that when that white is added, your color stays true. Remember, more chroma just translates into leaning more towards one pure color, one pure red, one pure yellow, one pure blue, with less equal parts of red, yellow, and blue. That will tend to neutralize or lower the chroma of a color. Now that we're getting into the last 30 minutes here of this video, you can see I'm trying to get into some really quite smaller shapes than I have before. I've got my really tiny rosemary brush here. This is a 1/8 inch comber, so I use this for a lot of my really small marks. Notice I'll use it kind of on the side, on the edge, to make some of these crisper lines and edges, and then I'll use it just on the broad side to make some of these smaller shapes in here. It even has a really nice quality that you don't really see me use here, but you'll see me use in some of the other videos, where this brush can be sort of twirled, rolled inside the paint. And even though it's a flat, because of the distribution of the hairs, it'll actually sort of roll the hairs into a point, and you can do really tiny, fine, delicate line work with this comber, because it can take on this nice pointed shape to it. So you can get a variety of brushwork. You can get this sort of more chiseled paint stroke mark, like the last couple that I made here. You can push into the palette there and splay some of the marks, which gives you kind of a broken brush mark, which I used on some of the transitions just a minute or so ago. It sort of makes a claw mark that locks some different colors into each other. Or you can roll it up and make a point and have a really fine line or fine little shape brush. Yeah, right there I've got it more into a point, so it made some really tiny, fine little marks there. But you need to have these really tiny strokes, tiny marks, tiny shapes that foil against all these larger shapes that we blocked in earlier. That's what gives something its real sense of finish and resolution. If you struggle with the look of your paintings being a lot more like a block-in throughout the stages of your painting process, it could just be that you're using too much of the same size brush and all of your shapes are floating towards the same size and orientation. And really the solution to that is either take out a larger brush and simplify some of the bigger areas, or take out a smaller brush and get some really small detail in there. Because it'll essentially, if everything is the same size shape, it's how people or your subject look when you are 20 or 25 feet away. They just look like really simple shapes, and it doesn't really feel as natural to how we would view a portrait or a figure painting, where we can see lots of little details and lots of little bits there. That's going to require that extra level of resolution, that extra level of smaller shapes in there to foil against the larger shapes. Also, it helps to establish a sense of focus here, having those tiny little marks towards the tendons in the arm and on the bicep versus some of these larger, broader shapes I'm trying to kind of scrub into the shoulder right now. That allows for, again, the viewer to see what's in focus, just like a camera. A camera focuses on one area, you see more shapes, more variety, more little bits of color, and then areas that are out of focus get blended and pushed together. That is true to how we see the world and observe the world. So that is how we need to paint if we want a more naturalistic painting. Now, some of these areas I am digging into with a brush that's probably a little bit smaller than I really need to be. Because ideally I wouldn't want to have to be softening too much out at this stage. What gets laid down should be coming in pretty close to the finish. And that's kind of working out in the forearm here and in the bicep and the tendons around the wrist. But some of those areas in the deltoid and the pectoralis, those really should have been handled with a larger brush, or at very least I'm going to have to now go back in and soften some of that out so it's not as distracting compared to the other areas that are more resolved here in the arm and the wrist. And I mean, you can kind of tell because the strokes made in the bicep and the forearm and the wrist area, they're a lot tighter together, a lot closer together, so they look a little more fluid. The ones in the shoulder and the bicep, they're just a little too kind of choppy. It indicates that there was too big of a change that was being made there between the under layers of the painting and the more finished layers of the painting. And as a result, if changes are going to be that dramatic, a larger brush should be used to coat that area instead of a finer, more detailed brush. You don't want to use really fine, detailed brushes for major structural or color changes. Need to come in here and get a little closer on describing the outer contour of the arm. And this is, again, another good example of painting shapes into shapes. I'm painting the background shape into the arm and the arm shape into the background. That's why it's not really necessary to get 100% precise with the actual drawing and contour of the arm in the beginning, because that tends to mitigate students' ability to really work one shape into another, and then they end up with those halos, or too timidly placing paint around the outer edges of their subject or in their background, which adjusts the color and chroma too poorly. So this will stay a little richer, a little cleaner, a little nicer, painting shape into shape, and so I can start going around and figuring out some of that contour, getting a little closer on some of that. I'm going across the form of the bicep there with those last few strokes. And really, you have to keep in mind, you don't see it from the picture-in-picture, but definitely when working from the model, that each time we look up there, a lot of these little pieces of anatomy are just ever so slightly different. And you have to make this decision about what you're going to try and keep and incorporate, and what you're going to toss out and just keep the way it was. And that is a really difficult sort of filtering process to go through, especially if you're inexperienced with either painting or inexperienced with anatomy, um, because you're just not really sure if you're painting something that really needs to be there and really needs to be included to reflect the anatomy of the picture that you're working on. And that's why we do so much drawing. All that those anatomy studies with that we did in the drawing year, and all the figure drawing we did in the drawing year, that should get us pretty close to having a good understanding of anatomy that needs to be included. And if one shape changes, how does that affect another shape? We don't just want to chase the anatomy that's shifting in the model in front of us when they're trying to do something more dynamic like this. We have to understand that if you adjust a bulge over here, you may need to adjust a bulge over here. So what's actually worth adjusting, and what can be left as how you have it indicated. Usually, for me at least, that goes through that filter of anatomy where I have to check the answering shapes and the answering muscles to make sure nothing too big is going to change, and then I'll really only change it if it's going to positively affect how the viewer sees the anatomy, like if it's going to make things look more dynamic or more dimensional. Otherwise, it's just a change for a change, and it's not really worth doing, and so I'll just leave what I have there. Notice I'm pulling the brush with a nice broad side of the brush, even though it's a small one. I'm not trying to go on the edge of the brush. I see too many students try to paint those contours with the edge of the brush, and then you run into some awkward buildup of paint on the sides of your subject. Really just paint with that big broad side. Cut into it like you're sculpting. And keep in mind those hard edges are really helping to make your paint look juicy and rich and your form look dimensional. Um, I see a lot of students either via insecurity or uncertainty of what to do next, or just with the misunderstanding that soft edges makes things look rounder, they soften too much of the form into the background, and unfortunately that makes things just look kind of mushy instead of solid and dimensional. So make sure that if you look up on the model and there's a pretty hard edge between the model and the background, you paint that pretty hard edge so things pop out and look strong enough and dimensional enough, and get your paint looking juicy and rich enough. It's pretty interesting how the idea of edges dovetails so much into dimensionality and value and color, and all the richness of chroma. That is, I think, one of the probably the biggest struggle I see with students, especially going into painting, is quality edge control, and that pretty much just trickles down to upset a lot of the other facets of their painting. Notice my comber right there was just a little splayed, so that was giving me a little bit of those gentle sort of claw tooth marks as I transitioned the light into the dark there. Having the appropriate amount of paint on your brush to get the mark you need or the softening you need is really paramount, and that takes quite a bit to sort of figure out. And especially if you're mixing into an area, trying to get the color right, you can end up getting a lot of paint buildup on your brush that you don't necessarily want to have. And so you might need to clean it off and then dip back into that puddle that you just mixed up to get it just right. So I've got a different brush for the background and a different brush for the actual flesh tone. And again, as I shift from one to the other, I just pick up a different brush, and that helps me make sure my colors stay nice and clean. I don't accidentally deposit some of that flesh tone color into the background or vice versa. It helps me maintain cleaner color and cleaner edges. So I'm trying to lock in now on some really tiny shapes, some really tiny variations here, um, and edge modulations in the arm with this background here. And keep in mind that until you become really familiar with anatomy, until you have done a lot of the assignments in the drawing and the assignments in the, um, from the drawing year, and working a lot from the model, you may need to actually use binoculars to see some of these tiny little shapes here. We've got all these little baby overlaps that are, forms tucking behind and in front of each other. They're all coming together to really create the illusion of dimensionality. Um, these angle changes combined with the little tiny edge changes all create that volume of form around the contour. The color and the value are doing all of the work inside of the form, but it's all these little tiny angle changes and little tiny edge changes that are doing the work around the outside of the form. So do whatever you need to see these clearly and to get a little more closely. If you need to use binoculars or actually just move up to your model, whatever you need to do so you can identify all of these and make sure you're making accurate statements. Don't just oversimplify the angles on the outside of the form. I see students do that quite frequently. Don't just oversimplify the edge quality and make it all too soft or all too hard. This has a huge, huge impact on what the volume of the form reads like. Even without all of that information that we spent a ton of time building up on the inside, that exterior does a lot of the work for the volume of form. So get really close, pay a lot of attention. Don't just kind of knock it in like a lot of people do. It really integrates the form into the background and gives it a lot of dimensionality. And so it's something to pay special attention to, because it's not a lot of work that you're doing. It's just little bits here, little bits there, but it certainly increases that dimensionality of the form with all these little changes here. I'm even laying in here with a little bit of some of reflected light color of that background that's bouncing into the arm, and that's going to give it a little bit extra um, volume. And notice I'm doing this right when I'm modulating the background and working the background into the form. Um, that's when you really want to work fine-tuning those colors and values for the outer perimeters, is when you're doing the background, because that's when you're going to cut in and shape and mold and kind of sculpt it together. The key to some of these hard edges here that you're seeing me get as I sort of bump out the anatomy here on the bottom is actually a greater volume of paint. And again, that's if you're having trouble getting some of these rich, crisp edges and sort of juicy paint, it's most likely due to the volume of your paint. And even perhaps if you're working on something like an inferior canvas, like a cotton acrylic prime that's really absorbent, it may just be sucking up so much of the oil that you're going to have a really hard time getting a lot of paint build up on here with these juicy colors. So it's just going to require you to pile even more paint on, especially towards the end here when you're looking to get some of these really nice, crisp, clean edges for your outer contours. Notice I realized that that paint was too dark, so as soon as it laid down and I identified it was too dark, I dipped into some lighter paint. It wasn't much lighter. You know, I see sometimes people identify it as too dark and then they immediately try to throw some white in there to lighten it up, but in this case it didn't really require it. In most cases it's just you need to shift to a color that's slightly lighter, and you can do that all with the colors available on your palette without having to add any white at all. Back again to that larger brush for the peripheral areas. And then we're going through our last final little softening here. You know, I tried to pump in now as much final detail as I can and really tried to follow the form um, with and across the anatomy here. But anything that's excuse me, standing out is still too distracting. That's what I'm going through here now and just knocking things down a little bit. Um, Getting things just a little more folded into the anatomy of what's there. Hopefully able to leave some little bits of directional marks speckling through. That's really going to help it have a more natural feel to it. You know, if it gets too blended, it might have like a waxy kind of super smooth feel, which I don't really want too much of. I want there to be just a little bit of texture, a little bit um, of those marks showing through. That way, you know, it gives me a little more information as far as the anatomy and more variety like in nature. And I'm just using my Master's brush here from Rosemary the Badger blend. It really is a really nice velvety softening brush. And just like before, it's just a stroke or two, just a very small area, and then wiping it off. And you know, here even now, I'm wiping it off even more frequently than before because since the last softening, I've built up so many more now, even more subtle, more fine, more delicate shifts in value and in color, and that's just going to require even more cleaning and softening of the brush to make sure I don't obliterate all that information and detail I'd spent so long working up. If this were a studio painting of mine that I was building up and I wanted it to be softer like this, I might actually wait quite a bit longer so that I could wait for the paint to set up and get really tacky and do some of the softening. That way I could ensure that my colors stay a little cleaner, a little more segregated. But for something like this, you know, we have a model, a limited amount of time. It's not as much like a studio piece where I'm combining knowledge and observation. You know, I'm really just trying to work mostly from observation here, which means I really want the model here for most of my softening. And I'm not just arbitrarily softening because it needs to be softened. You know, I'm really looking at the model and trying to identify the edge quality of the little bits of shapes that I see up there, and trying to base all my softening decisions off of that. Everything has to fit into this grand hierarchy of edges, soft versus hard, both in the lights and in the darks. Last little final bits here. We'll sort of refocus the viewer back into the areas of smaller mark making, which is the wrist, the forearm, the bicep, as we soften out all these other surrounding areas here. One of the things that I'll sometimes do, you don't really see on here, is I'll wipe my brush off the paper towel, scrub it on a canvas on the side just to make sure there's no color on it before I go back in and soften things out. It just gives me a little extra security that I'm not going to redistribute some paint in various areas on the painting right now. And just keep in mind, you want as much color change as you can within the form, and then really modulate those edges and angle changes around the contour to help give that extra boost of form. Notice how parallel my brush is to the surface of the canvas also. I'm not stabbing at it, I'm just trying to gently pull one shape into another. And that's about it.